Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Samach Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Becky Ray in honor of her sister Naomi Cohen on her birthday this past Friday. Your dedication and commitment is truly inspiring. May continue to grow Michayel Achayel with joy in your learning. Okay, we're going to get started with the Mishnah at the top of our daf. Today we're going to finish the 5th parak and move on to a new chapter. Ha'omer harei alai b'machvat. We're going to deal with a lot today. Sounds a little like neder, like nedarim. If I say something, what did I mean by what I said? That's at least going to be part of our discussion. So if you say harei alai b'machvat, which if you remember, there's different kinds of menachot that you can bring that are voluntary offerings. There's the solet, which is not baked or prepared at all beforehand. Then there's machvat and marcheshet. Each one, before we do the kmitza, is prepared in a pan. We're going to talk about what the difference between a machvat and a marcheshet is. And then we're going to get in the next mishnah to the ma'afet tanur, which are the next two types, which is really one type called the ma'afet tanur, but is made up of two different types. One are chalot matzot and one are rikikim. We're going to talk about the difference between them when we get to the next mishnah. So right now we're focusing on machvat and marcheshet. Until now, we basically said that a machvat is a flat pan, like a griddle pan, which is flat and has really no sides, and the marcheshet is a deep pan. Okay, but we're going to see that there's a machloket in the Mishnah. Whenever we've said that, we're basically taking Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel's position. You'll see that there's a completely different position which understands it not the way we said. And then we'll see in the Gemara even, there's some discussion that maybe there's even a third position of Beit Shammai, that it's not even clear these were two different pans at all. Or the truth is even within the first opinion, we're going to see Rabbi Yossi Aglili, it's not clear there were two different pans. It seems like it was the same type pan. So let's read that. Now, the first thing the Mishnah says is, if you say machvat, it has to be done in machvat. If you say I'm going to bring it in a marcheshet, it has to be done in marcheshet. Now the question is, which is which? What's the difference between them? Ma bein machvat lemarcheshet. Marcheshet yesh la kisui. Machvat en la kisui. Devar Rabbi Yossi Aglili. One is a cover, one doesn't have a cover. Okay, right? Like when you read recipes, right? Some things you're supposed to cook covered, some things you're supposed to cook uncovered. And we all know they come out very different. If you're supposed to cover it and you don't, or you're not supposed to cover it and you do, it cooks very differently. So basically, it sounds like it's the same pan. Probably has some sides, because otherwise you can't put a cover on it. It wouldn't be this flat pan that we talked about before. And one is covered, one isn't covered. It's unclear to me whether they're different pans and one comes with a cover, one doesn't come with a cover, one doesn't have a way to put a cover on, not really clear. But it seems like marcheshet has a cover and machvat doesn't have a cover. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel omer, marcheshet amuka u'maaseh rochashin, or perhaps rakin, which is going to make a little more sense from the next line. You'll see, machvat tzafa u'maaseh kashin. So the marcheshet is deep, and therefore what you make in it is softer because it has thickness to it. If you can only put a flat layer in, because that's the machva, which is tzafa, it's flat, then what comes out is going to be harder. Okay? Now, we're going to start with the Gemara that's going to try to figure out what is the basis for Rabbi Yossi Aglili's position and what is the basis for Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel's position. Where do they each get it from? My Talmid Rabbi Yossi. Ilema. Now, this one's going to be one of these knockout. If you think this, we could say the opposite, and then we're going to be a little bit stuck, and you'll see what the Gemara does instead. So they suggest, they're going to try to darshan the word, marcheshet. What's the root? So marcheshet sounds like rechushe halev. Now, what are rechushe halev? So let's read. Kidichtiv, we're going to quote a pasuk that shows us what this means. Rachash libi dvar tov. What I'm thinking in my heart is a good thing. There's a pasuk from Tehillim. And what they're going to say is, that the marcheshet must come. Now we're going to take this word rachash, which means what you're thinking in your heart, to also bad things. What does a marcheshet come to atone for? There's a sense, if somebody brings this, they want to be atoning for something. Even though it's a voluntary offering, they're bringing it for atonement purposes. So it atones for any bad thoughts you've had in your heart. Okay, anything right now, your heart or your brain really, but that's what they call it, the heart. So anything you have bad thoughts, this comes to atone for it. And that's why it's called marcheshet. Now, what does that have to do with a pan with a cover? Because your heart is covered, as opposed to, what we're going to see now with the machvat. U'machvat ta'atya machvo'eh hapeh. Now, machbo is usually a hiding place. That's not what they're talking about here. Here, they're using the word, and it's a little bit strange what they're doing. They're taking machavo with, let's say you say it's a 2-letter root, chet bet, and they're switching it to bet chet. If you put bet chet and you add a nun to it, a nun is a word that in roots like can be added. Also in those days there were a lot more 2-letter roots. In our day they've expanded more to 3. That's a whole different story, but we're going to leave that aside right now. But they say, what does this mean? We'll see in a minute what it means. Now, if you know the word linbach in Hebrew language is barking. What is barking? It's you say not nice things out of your mouth. So that's machvo'eh peh, not things hidden in your mouth. It's things that come out of your mouth. Now those are out in the open. Okay, they're said, and they also come from your mouth, which you can see, as opposed to your heart, which you can't see. So that's why marcheshet is a reference to. So now we have these 2 different menachot. Each one comes to a tone. This is the suggestion that the Gemara is going to reject. But right now we're going to suggest that the marcheshet comes to atone for rachashe, for things you think of in your heart, meaning they're inside, they're covered, as opposed to things you bark out with your mouth, which are uncovered. So that's the machvat, which comes for that's why it's uncovered. But ema ipcha, you could say the opposite with those roots. You could play with it and say the opposite. Machvata atya machvoe halev. Dichtiv, you could say the machvat is because of it. Now, machvat, like we normally think of a machvo, of a hidden. Okay, they're hidden in your heart. Dichtiv, you could say that's the word machavo could also be hidden. It could also be, if you switch it, nabach, to bark, but it could also be things hidden in your heart, and then that should have a cover, and it doesn't, because machvat is the one without a cover. Dichtiv, and then they quote a pasuk, lama nichbeta livrach. Okay, why were you hiding to run away? Marcheshet ta'atya rechushe. Now rechushe, before we said, means thoughts in your heart from the pasuk we quoted, rachash libi davar tov. But you could also say, keda'amri inashe hava merachshan siftote. My lips were chattering, were moving, were speaking. Okay, the things that it could even be maybe whispering, but the point is there are also things that come out of your mouth. So rachash could also be something that comes out of your mouth, which means it would be uncovered. So that doesn't work, because basically those words could be used to mean opposite things. Okay, I want you to just notice something interesting in the structure. Each time, the first suggestion, they quoted a pasuk to prove the understanding of using the word in that way. And the second one, they quoted like people say on the street. Okay, kedamri nashe, I always say on the street. I mean, it just means the way people speak. Okay, so it's just interesting to see the structure. One's pasuk, one's this, but in either way, they say that doesn't work because it could go either way. Ela gemara gemirala. It must be that he had a tradition about it. Okay, it was just, he learned it by tradition. Now, there's something weird about the language here. It depends whether, often when the Gemara uses the term Gemara Gemirala, it usually means Halacha L'Moshe Sinai. It would be very strange to say this is Halacha L'Moshe Sinai. Why? Well, first of all, there's a machloket about it. And generally, not always, but generally, Halacha L'Moshe Sinai are these ancient traditions passed down, okay, whether they were actually passed down to Moshe at Sinai, or they're just saying it's somewhere in between what we call Deoraita and Derabana, rabbinic and Torah law and rabbinic. But it would be very hard to say that here, even if you say maybe there is a machloket, this is not the position we hold by, because we don't hold that it's whether it has a cover or doesn't have a cover. We hold by Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel. So it would be very hard to say that. Some people actually take out the words Gemirala, because they say it's not Halacha L'Moshe Sinai, and it just says Ela Gemara. Gemara is, it's a tradition. Okay, he had a tradition about it. Then that makes it much less. Or some people just say Gemara Gemirala. It doesn't mean always Halacha L'Moshe Sinai. And that has ramifications other places when Gemara Gemirala appears. If you say that here it doesn't mean it, then you could theoretically say in other places it doesn't mean it. Okay, that's a side point. Now we're going to move back to our topic. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel. So we basically tried in this section to figure out, could we get from the words to the fact that we could darshan why this has a cover, this one doesn't, and having to do with which sins does each one atone for. But we said you could prove itself in the opposite. So in the end, we just say it's a tradition. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel Omer. Now he said it's deep and flat. So how does he get it? Now in the psukim where it discusses this, these marcheshet and machvat, it says v'chol naaseh b'marcheshet. When it's done in a marcheshet, as opposed to the machvat safa dichtiv ve'al machvat, on the machvat. One is in and one is on. On would then be the flat one, and in would be the deep one. And that is a good explanation. And like I said, that's the one we accept. Now comes Beit Shammai in this Braita. We're going to quote a Braita. The Machloket Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel. Tanu Rabbanan. Beit Shammai Omrim, Ha'omer Hare Alai Marcheshet. Now, this is different from what the Mishnah said. Pay close attention. The Mishnah said, Harei alai b'machvat, Harei alai b'marcheshet. If I'm going to take upon myself in a pan, either this pan or that pan, then I have to bring a mincha in that pan. Come Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, and they have a machloket. What if I say Harei alai machvat or Harei alai marcheshet? I'm taking upon myself a pan, not in a pan. In a pan, obviously, I mean the mincha in the pan. What if I just say the pan I take upon myself? Now that could mean one of two things. It could mean what I meant is I'm bringing a mincha in that pan, or it could mean I'm dedicating that pan to the temple, which either means I have to bring the pan to the temple, or I have to bring its value to the temple. That's what we call kedushat damim, because it's not anything that's going to be offered on the altar, so it's just the value, inherent value, and then I have to bring the value of it to the temple, not the actual item. So Beit Hillel says, Beit Shammai says, the problem is we don't really know what I meant when I said that. Did I mean Harei alai marcheshet, a mincha, or Harei alai to bring a pan called the marcheshet? Yehei munach ad sheyavo Eliyahu. So he says, we don't know what you meant, so we have to leave this until Yavo Eliyahu. That's Rashi's interpretation. Now, a lot of the commentaries have difficulty with Rashi's interpretation because they say this is a classic example where you actually have a solution. You bring both a mincha and a machvad, and you bring a machvad, or both a mincha and a marcheshet and a marcheshet. And there's a way to resolve it. Just bring, right, the pan and the mincha. So you have to spend a little extra money, but you don't have to leave it till Eliyahu comes and determines. So there's all different interpretations given. I wanted to just suggest one of them, the Shita Mekubetzet, which is actually on the side of the page of your Gemara, if you have a regular Gemara. So the Shita Mekubetzet takes issue with Rashi and says, L'chach nireh lefaresh, okay, I'm a few lines down, Yal shem kelim shayu b'mikdash yikolom marcheshet. One second, let me just find where he says this. Right. He suggests that it's not clear whether there were, if the name machvat and marcheshet are two different pans, which was pretty clear from our Mishnah, but remember, this is Beit Shammai. He doesn't have to go with our Mishnah, right? This could be a different interpretation because he's a Tana. So the fact that he doesn't appear in the Mishnah doesn't mean, okay? So he says, Iyal shem kelim shayu b'mikdash, kli sheshmo marcheshet, v'tzarich lavi b'marcheshet. It's pretty clear it's a mincha. It's just, do you need to bring it in a marcheshet? O dilma lo haya b'mikdash ki im machvat v'gam mincha marcheshet, haya oseh b'machvat, shaya b'me'et ba'or ad shumaseh rochashin, v'lo yom rav hev Hashem. Okay, I'm not going to get into the details. But what he basically is saying is, it's not clear whether when it says in the Torah in a machvat or on a machvat or in a marcheshet, do they mean two different vessels? Or is it just two different ways of cooking in the same vessel? And then we're stuck because we don't know what was meant by that. Okay, some people take this also, just to give you one more and then we'll stop with this, but because it gets a little sometimes too confusing when you have too many interpretations. Some people think that they're not clear which definition of machvat and marcheshet is, and then you're stuck, and then you can't do either one because is it with a cover, not with a cover, deep or flat? So then you're just stuck and you can't do it anyway because you don't know if you're doing it right, and you can't bring a mincha if it's like chulin bazara, like if you're not supposed to. So that could be also Beit Shammai. So it's very unclear what Beit Shammai's issue was, that he gave this severe, it's never good to say, well, you made a promise and you can't keep it now, we have to wait till Eliyahu comes and tells us what to do. Okay, so that's Beit Shammai. So then the Gemara goes a little more in depth into his what his sefek is, and I'll read it inside now. And again, this could be interpreted in different ways. I'll go now with Rashi's just to keep it simple, even though Rashi, I think, is the most difficult interpretation because it doesn't really explain why you have to leave it ad sheyavo Eliyahu. But misapgalu al shum kli nikru or al shum masehen. Are they called because of the kli, or are they called because of their maasim? In other words, is it a mincha in a machvat, and then when you say machvat, you just mean the machvat? Or is it because it's called a machvat, which means because it's done in a machvat? Okay, and then it goes by the maasim, and then you would bring, the mincha. Beit Hillel omrim, kli haya b'mikdash u'marcheshet shma, v'domeh kemin kalabus amok, כשבצק מונח בתוכו דומה כמין תפוחי הבaratim, or it could be karatim, וכמין בלוטי היווני. Okay, so let's stop for a minute and explain this. He says there was a vessel in the temple. Okay, there's pictures on the side, depending on what version of the Gemara you have. There's different kind of pictures, and the Shanstein and the Koran actually have the exact same picture. Most people go with that, which I think is the Shita Mekubetzet's explanation, which is that it was a pan with a handle, and it had like a horseshoe shape to it, the pan itself, and it had holes in it. It sounds a little like a poacher, okay, but a little different. It went deep, like round indentations, and in that they would put the dough. It would sink to the bottom, and it would have this rounded look, like these apples or this Greek something that they would have. Okay, they were just using examples of things that they know. And ve'omer, and he says, look at the pasuk. Acorns. Thank you. I couldn't remember what the balute were. Thank you. Acorns. They were acorns of the Greeks. So they had these rounded shapes. Okay, you can see like these pictures in your Gemara, maybe if you have it or not, but with these rounded things. Okay, it was some kind of pan. Now he uses the same pasuk we thought about before, which is something done in a marcheshet or on a pan, which before we used a different way, but what he's saying is it makes it obvious that the word marcheshet and the word machvat was just a type of pan, which means that if you say harei alai machvat, you obviously meant the pan, and therefore all you bring is the pan. Alma al shuma kelim nikru v'lo al shuma sehem. Right? We don't call a machvat a mincha and a machvat. We call a machvat a pan. And if you say I'm doing a mincha in a machvat or I'm doing it in a machvat, then you mean the mincha. But the pan itself is just a pan. And anyone who says harei alai machvat, you're just bringing a pan. Harei alai. Now the Mishnah goes the next Mishnah. Okay, we're finished with that Mishnah. The second thing we're going to discuss right now is harei alai bitanur. I'm going to do this in an oven. So now we're moving to the minchat ma'afeh, which, as I said before, are rikikim and chalot. Let's talk for a minute about what they are. Okay, the pasuk says that chita kliv korban mincha. We're going to darshan this pasuk a lot soon. If you're going to bring, it's chapter 2, verse 4. If you're going to bring a korban mincha, ma'afeh tanur baked in an oven. Solet use solet, like all the other, or like almost most of the other korbanot. Chalot matzot blulot b'shemen. So they can be made of chalot matzot. Now, don't get confused, not challah, it's matzah. Matzah chalot. Chalot is just a loaf. Matzah loaves that are mixed in oil. This is going to be the main difference between them. These are mixed in oil. Rikikei matzot, the rikikim, which are often translated as wafers, but it's more like a lafa, if you know what lafas are, right? Like flat kind of breads. Rikikei matzot mishuchim bashem. Those are made with just flour and water, but then you put oil on it after. Okay, you would put it like in an X. They're mishuchim b'shemen. You just anoint it with oil, which the way the kelim in the temple, you would put an X on them. These are also, you put an X on them. It's the Greek letter ki, or their kaf, whatever you call it, and it's really ki. So anyway, it's an X. So now, if you say, back to the Mishnah, harei alai bitanur, I'm going to make it in an oven. Lo yavi, now we're going to talk about what kind of oven can you use. Lo ma'avi ma'afeh kupach, don't make it in a kupach, which is a mini oven. V'lo ma'afeh rafim, don't cook it on a roof tile. Okay, right, you could heat your roof tile. Thinking of practicing it and seeing if we could do it, right? Heat your roof tile up. In the summer here, you could probably for sure do that and cook something on it. V'lo, also, right, if you make those lafa kind of breads, right? People make them on things that are just heated up, basically. Uma'afeh yorot ha'araviyim. Here, there's a difference of opinion what this is. Some people explain that they would make these pits in the ground and they would cook things in there. Okay, they kind of make like their own pot out of the ground, and it would cook underground. So those are not called ovens. Again, we're back to your language. You said in an oven. In an oven does not include these other things. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ratzah mevi ma'afeh kupach. If you want, you could bring a ma'aseh kupach, because that is an oven. It's just a small oven, but it is an oven. Harei alai minchat ma'afeh. Okay, this seems to be a continuation of Rabbi Yehuda, because later we're going to see Rabbi Yehuda is quoted as saying this. If you say, I'm going to bring a minchat ma'afeh, which is basically what the Torah is talking about, lo yavi, here's the big machloket that we mentioned earlier on in the Masechet, lo yavi mechza chalot u'mechza rikikim. You can't bring half, 5 loaves and 5 wafers, or 5 chalot, 5 rikikim. Rabbi Shimon matir metneshu korban echad. Rabbi Shimon sees this all as one korban. He says it's totally fine. So now we're going to see the basis for both machlokot in the Mishnah. We have 2 machlokot. Does tanur include also the kupach or not? And can you bring half? So Tanu Rabbanan, we're going to see Braitot, which have all the drashot for what we're looking for. Ma'afeh tanur v'lo ma'afeh kupach v'lo ma'afeh rafim v'lo ma'afeh yorot haraviyim. Okay, that's what we saw so far. Right? That's just a quote like our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, tanul shnei pa'amim, lachshir ma'afeh kupach. Rabbi Yehuda says tanur twice in the psukim. Now, one is in chapter 2, when it calls it a mafet tanur, and one is in chapter 7, where it also refers to the same kind of mincha, which we've talked about. Right? One is Kohanim, one is Yisrael, but they claim, well, it says tanur twice, we can darshan it. Once for a kupach, and right, one's for the regular oven, and one to include even a kupach. Rabbi Shimon Omer, tanur shnei pa'amim. No, it's 2 times for a different reason. He disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda. Echad shetei afiyatam b'tanur, v'echad shetei hekidei sham b'tanur. One, that it should cook in the oven, bake in the oven. And that's the basic halacha. That's how you do this. You bake it in an oven. I want to remind you, what you do with these is, you bake them in the oven before you do the kmitza. Then you break them up into small pieces. Then you do the kmitza, right? And then the rest can be eaten. But after you bake them, it's a little bit strange, right? Then you break it up again. Some people think you even break it up until it becomes solet again, which is very strange. Why do you bother baking it to then turn it back into solet? Some people just say they're smaller, right? They're bigger chunks than the solet. They're just smaller than fully baked. Anyway, he says, one is to teach you the basic halacha. You have to bake them in the oven before you do the kmitza. And the other set is to say that they actually become sanctified in the oven. That's what sanctifies them. Okay, this is going to lead the Gemara to a big question, because this is Rabbi Shimon, and it's going to contradict something Rabbi Shimon says later on in the Masechet. Rabbi Shimon Haisvarit, does he really have this logic that they're sanctified in the oven? Doesn't he say, now we're moving from the ma'afet tanur to the shtei alechem and the lechem apanim, but there's an assumption that it would be the same. V'hatznan, Rabbi Shimon Omer, la'olam havei ragil omal, you should always say, shtei alechem v'lechem apanim ksherot b'azara u'ksherot b'bei pagi. They're allowed, there's lechem apanim and the shtei alechem can be baked in the oven in the azara, okay, but they can also be baked in beit pagi. Huge debate what beit pagi is. No matter what it is, whether it's outside the temple courtyard, whether it's outside Har HaBayit entirely, the point is it's outside the temple courtyard. And it can be baked there. Now, if the sanctification of the ma'afet tanur, and then presumably also the shtei alechem and the lechem apanim, are done in the oven, okay, as you said before, she'ech desham b'tanur, then you can't do that outside the azara. You can't do a sanctification process outside the azara. Okay, here also there's a lot of different interpretations going on here, what exactly the issue is, but we'll stick with that right now. So Amarava, a very strange answer to resolve this difficulty. By the way, this is a big issue. This is a big question whether the lechem apanim and the shtei alechem are sanctified in the oven. Rabbi Shimon doesn't think so. Most people think the oven. If you remember, we had a sugi about the oven being a klei sharet. It is a sanctified vessel. In which case, right, things that don't get sanctified in the bowl get sanctified. Right now, some get sanctified in the bowl already, but some don't. If you don't need to be mixed with oil, then they'll get sanctified in the bowl, and then they get sanctified in the oven. He thinks, let's say, for example, the lechem apanim, what sanctifies them? The putting them on the shulchan. And which is the later process, right? That's done once they're baked already, not in the oven. That's what Rabbi Shimon holds. And the shtei alechem, when you slaughter the fasim, that's what sanctifies the loaves, right? First the loaves are prepared before you slaughter the sheep, and when you slaughter the sheep, that sanctifies the bread. So there's these different opinions, which we'll deal with when we get to later on, Rabbi Shimon's opinion straight on. So comes Rava with a weird explanation, I think. It's hard to understand. Amar Rava, Ema, well, we're going to reread what Rabbi Shimon said by us. Tanur shnei pa'amim, we said one tanur is to teach you this halacha, it has to go in the oven. And the second one we said that it becomes sanctified in the oven, which we say based on the shtei alechem and the lechem apanim, doesn't really, in his opinion there, doesn't make sense. So, Ema shiehei hekdeshan l'shum tanur. Now, this is difficult because why would you need to do this? Let's just explain what it means, though. He's saying that when you say I'm going to bring a ma'afet tanur, you have to say that when you take the solet, you have to say I'm sanctifying this solet to be used for the purposes of an oven, to be used in an oven. Like you already, from the time you take the solet, you have to say what mincha you're using it for. Okay? Why you have to do that, it's not so clear, and the commentaries, again, go into different interpretations. Today I'm going to more raise some questions. In some of the cases, I'll give you a bunch of answers, so I'm going to leave it as a question. Okay. Now we're going to get to the real big issue here, which is the half-half. And what's this machloket about? And we're going to see it all in a bright. Tanu Rabbanan. So first they're going to darshan this pasuk. The first drasha has nothing really to do with our machloket here. V'chi takriv. starts off the pasuk, V'chi takriv korban mincha ma'afet tanur. So if you're going to bring a korban mincha, that's baked in the oven. V'chi takriv, kishet takriv. What does that mean? When you, V'chi takriv means if you want to. This is telling you, la'asot davar reshut. This is all voluntary. Okay, that's very clear. Now, korban mincha, amar Rabbi Yehuda, minayin la'omer. So why does it say korban mincha? Okay, you didn't really need those words. You could have just said, Ki takriv ma'afet tanur. It would be obvious we're talking about a mincha, we're talking about a korban mincha, or you could just say, Ki takriv mincha ma'afet tanur. Why do I add the word korban? Comes Rabbi Yehuda and says, minayin la'omer arei alai mincha ma'afet, shelo yavi mechza chalot u'mechza rikikim. Talmud lomar, korban mincha, korban lachan amarti lacha, velo shnayim u'shlosha korbanot. Okay, when it says korban, it means one korban, meaning it has to be one korban and not one type and not two types. So even though we get into later in the pasuk two different types, each one has to be brought separately. You can't bring half and half. You either are bringing one or the other. That's why it says korban in singular form. Okay, that's the first interpretation. I want to go back just because Becky asked a question, so I'm going to relate to it though, because I think it's important to clarify. Becky asked, why aren't these vessels in the previous section, why aren't they sanctified in the kli sharet? Remember, when you put the dough in the kli sharet. So first of all, I want to remind you, the shtei alechem and the lechem apanim don't have oil in them. So they only go in the dry measuring. There's no liquid measuring going on, and there's no bowl where they get mixed. So because of that, they're not actually sanctified earlier on, because they don't have to go in this vessel. And same thing for the rikikim, which also don't have oil. Anything without oil, the midot hayavesh, okay, the dry didn't necessarily, there's a machloket about it. Are they sanctified, or could they be sanctified or not? So there's a lot of debates going on here that affect all this. That's why I didn't want to go into too much detail, but since you asked, I addressed it. So there is this debate about whether, and these are different than the regular menachot. Again, the one of them is balul b'shemen, so it's a little tricky there. But the other one is not. So it's not 100% clear. It's a good question you're asking, and there's some ways of answering it, but there's a lot. This stuff has a lot of things that are complicated to figure out everything. Okay, next. So we started with ki takriv. It's a reshut. Okay, that everyone agrees with. Then we move to korban mincha. He says singular. Korban means one type. You can only do one type. You can't do both types. You do this one or you do that one. Amar le Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says to him, turning now to Amud Beth, v'china amar korban shnei pamim. It doesn't say korban by this one and korban for that one. Halo lo ne'amar le korban echad. V'ne'amar bo chalot u'rikikim. Me'ata ratza lavi chalot. Mevi rikikim mevi. This is what I mean. It says korban. And then it says rikikim and chalot. Or chalot and rikikim in that order. But it sounds, if you wanted to say separate korban, it would have said korban this, korban that. It didn't say korban this, korban that. Okay, later the Gemara is going to say, that's a good point. What is Rabbi Yehuda going to say to that? Okay, but we're going to continue on the Braita, which doesn't relate to that. Now he continues and he says, so what do you do? If you bring mechza chalot and mechza rikikim, how do you do it? Because remember, Rabbi Shimon says you could either do all rikikim, you could do all chalot, or you could do half-half. So what if you did half-half? Bolilan, you're going to mix the oil in. Now it seems to be this a little tricky. You don't mix the oil into both. But I guess you mix them into the chalot is what he's saying. And then you have the other dough, which probably is just with some water. V'kometz, then you put them all together. Kometz mishnehem. So after you, okay, now there's a few processes here that they don't discuss. But what do? You basically prepare those, 5 loaves of those, 5 of those. Then you put them in the oven, you bake them. Then you break them up into pieces, and you put them all together. And then you take a kamitza of a mixture, of a combination of the two. If by accident somehow you only ended up with the rikikim or only the chalot in your kmitza, right? Because you can't exactly mix it perfectly. If you ended up with only one of them, it's fine. That covers your 10, even though 5 are this and 5 are that, and you only took from one. Okay, that's just technically how you do it according to his opinion. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Now the son of Rabbi Yehuda comes and pipes in. Now, what's left? We brought a pasuk for Rabbi Yehuda, we brought a pasuk for Rabbi Shimon. What he's going to do is bring a different pasuk that proves Rabbi Yehuda's position. The Gemara is going to ask later, well, what does he disagree with Rabbi Yehuda about? Why is he listed separately? So, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Minayin, we'll get to that only in the Gemara. Right now we're in the Braita. Minayin Omer, Harei alai mincha ma'afeh, shelo yavi mechza chalot u'mechza rikikim. How do you know if you say, I'm going to bring a mincha ma'afeh, that you can't bring half-half? He agrees with his father, but he brings a different pasuk. Instead of the korban, he brings a different pasuk. Talmud Lamal. V'chol mincha asher te'afeh b'tanur. Okay, this pasuk, Perek Zayin, psukim 9 to 10. V'chol mincha asher te'afeh b'tanur, any mincha that you bake in the oven. V'chol na'aseh b'marcheshet v'al machvat, and anything that you put in a marcheshet or a machvat. Okay, category 1 is mafet tanur. Category 2 is mincha machvat. Notice the word v'chol appears before every section here. Okay, we'll go l'kohen ha'makriv ota lo tiyeh. The kohen will get the remainder. V'chol mincha b'lula b'shemen v'chareva, and all menachot that are mixed with oil or not mixed with oil. Remember the mincha chote, the mincha sota. L'chol b'nei Aaron tiyeh. Also, b'nei Aaron will get it. So what does he say? He says, oh, look what they're comparing. They have section 1 is ma'afet tanur, which includes rikikim and chalot. Section 2 is mincha mercheshet. Section 3 is charevan yevesha, right? Charevan belula, mixed with oil, not mixed with oil. Ma v'chol ha'amur lamata shnei minim chalukim. Now, since there's 2 different types, and by the way, if you put oil in the type that's not supposed to have oil, it's disqualified. So af kol ha'amur lamala shnei minim chalukim. So also the one above, the ma'afet tanur, must be 2 different types that you can't mix and combine them. You can't do the dry one and bring half with oil, half not with oil. Right? You can't mix them. You can't take a machvad and do half machvad, half marcheshet. So likewise, the same with this. Okay, so that's the end of the Braita. Now the Gemara deals with it. It says, Rabbi Yehuda, Shapir Kama Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon has a good claim when he says, it doesn't say korban by each one to differentiate them. It says korban, and it says this type, that type. Sounds like they're all part of one korban. Amar Lacha, Rabbi Yehuda could say, Kiban dachtiv bashemen. Bashamen, kiban dachtiv korban, korban dami. Now, what does it say in the pasuk? It says, V'chol mincha blu, sorry, not that one. V'chi takriv korban mincha ma'afet tanur. We're back to Perek Be, pasuk Dalid. Solet, chalot matzot blulot bashemen, urikikei matzot meshuchim bashamen. Now, why does it say, it could have said, okay, what was this? Make these loaves of matzah mixed with oil, and rikikei matzot, the wafers of matzah wafers, or whatever you call them, meshuchim with oil. Now, oil appears twice. You could have just skipped the word oil in the beginning. These are mixed with, and those are anointed with oil. And then it would have been oil for both, right? But he says, the fact that it says oil in the middle there comes to separate that these are 2 separate things. That's why they added that extra word oil in the middle, that to separate. Kiman dechtiv, it's as if it says korban dami, but these are differentiated. And what's Rabbi Shimon going to respond to that? Again, this is just the Gemara putting words in their mouths. We don't know what they really responded. Rabbi Shimon, lo ktav b'shemen bashamen, hava amina dafka mechza chalot umechza rikikim. Ava chalot l'chudayu v'chikin l'chudayu emalo. He says, I agree with you that distinguishes. But what does that tell me? He says, that tells me I could either bring chalot, I could either bring rikikim, or I could bring both. If it hadn't said b'shemen, I would have actually said the only way to bring this ma'afet tanur is half-half, because it says rikikim and chalot, without any separator. In fact, as a separator means these are 3 possibilities. Okay, so now comes Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, and the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, Hainu Avua. He's the same thing as his father. What's he adding by adding this additional pasuk? Now, before we get to the Gemara's answer, I wanted to suggest a possible other answer. The Gemara doesn't, which is Rabbi Yehuda's pasuk already got knocked out by Rabbi Shimon in the Braita, and maybe Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda was coming with another pasuk to support his father's position. But it's not what the Gemara says. The Gemara thinks that there's actually 3 different positions, and why is that? Maybe because of the order. Again, you could claim based on what I was suggesting is the order showing, well, Rabbi Yehuda, then came Rabbi Shimon, he disagreed with Rabbi Yehuda, and then, but maybe you should have brought it after Rabbi Shimon argued against Rabbi Yehuda's proof. And anyway, the Gemara assumes that this is a 3rd position, because they're kind of listed as 3 separate positions. So what could be the difference? I mean, he basically says you can't bring half-half. So the difference is, ikabenayu diavad. B'diavad, if you did it already, then would it be disqualified? According to Rabbi Yehuda, if you did half-half, it wouldn't be disqualified. Okay, you shouldn't do it, but it wouldn't be disqualified. Why? Well, we're going to see. Because according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, it would be. Because what did we say before? If you're going to do the shemen in the one that's chareva, which he compares it to, the dry one, we already learned that if you put shemen in a dry one, it disqualifies it. So therefore, if he's learning it from there, you would assume then it's disqualified if you did it the wrong way. Okay, and that ends this Perek, Hadran alach kol Menachot, and with that we finish our chapter. Okay, so these were what we mainly dealt with today. Besides we learned the differences between the different Menachot. Also, the Mishnah, at least, was focused a lot on your words. If you say, Harei alai, this, what does it mean? And also that Mechlope Shammai. Okay, what does it mean? Maybe we'll do a quick review here before we finish up the daf. It's a whole new topic. So we started with Machvad and Marcheshet and what the difference is between a Machvad and a Marcheshet, two different opinions. What's the source for the two different opinions? Then we got to the Harei alai bit tanur. What, number one, which kind of tanur can you use? What is not considered a tanur? We had a machloket about this small kupach. Then we said, what if you say Harei alai? Or what if you say I'm going to bring a ma'afet tanur? Can you bring half for kikim and chalot? And what was the basis of that machloket? Okay, that's mainly what we did. Now we're going to start a new chapter. Now there's something confusing about this, which I'll just point out at the beginning of class, at the beginning of the section, which is, this is the 6th chapter, but if you look in Mishnayot, it's the 10th chapter. It's a very weird thing. Most people think that, like, even some versions of the Gemara have it in the 10th chapter, and this really does seem to be out of order. So I will point that out. When we get to the next chapter, you'll see that next chapter follows much more smoothly with what we were talking about. Now we're basically going into the Korban HaOmer, okay, the Minchat HaOmer that we bring, and I'll give you some background. So the Minchat HaOmer is brought on Tet Zayin B'Nisan. Why is that? It says Mimachorat HaShabbat. This is a big machlokah between the Baitusim and the Prushim. Right, the Prushim are the rabbis. The Baitusim was a different sect. They took it literally from the Shabbat after Pesach. So whenever Pesach, right, they would do it the Shabbat after, right? Motzei Shabbat they would do this, and the Prushim said no. We do it on the night after the Machorat HaShabbat. The Shabbat there means Pesach, even though it's definitely not the simple reading. And because of that, they did all sorts of things. One thing we're going to see in our Mishnah is a possible reason why they did it is to show we're against the Baitusim. If you remember with the Para Aduma, they would do this also, where they were against what the Stukim said, and they would specifically make someone a Tvul Yom just to show we're right. There were all these things where they disagree with these sects, and they did something more public to say, we're doing it today, and we're doing it according to our reading. Okay. And then basically you would bring this mincha. It came from barley. They would go out that night after Pesach day. So that night after the first Chag, they would go out and start reaping, harvesting the crop for the barley. Then they would go and the next morning they would sacrifice it. And they would go through this process. We're going to see about getting it down to a very fine flour. They would take a certain amount and they would get it down to a very fine flour. And then they would sacrifice it, and it was from the new grains, and then that would permit the new grains to be eaten, the chadash. So Rabbi Yishmael Omer hayaba b'Shabbat mishalosh se'in. On Shabbat, if you did it on Shabbat, okay, let's say Tet Zayin came out on Shabbat, so you would do it from 3 se'in of barley. 3 se'in, by the way, is an ephah. Now, why is that important? Because you're going to take 1 ephah and you're going to whittle it down to an isaron. What's an isaron? 1/10 of an ephah. You want to get to the finest flour, it's 3 se'ah to get down to 1. But that's what you would do on Shabbat, he says. Bechol, if it was a weekday, mechamesh, you would use 5. And get the 5 down, which is more than, obviously, 1 ephah. So you would end up with, it would take even more, right? You would have much less than 1/10. You would end up getting it down to, and as you end up with 1/10 of an ephah, but you start with much more. Chachamim omrim, echad Shabbat ve'echad chol mishalosh hayaba. Never needs 5, even on a Yom Chol. So, okay, we'll talk about this machloket soon. Second machloket. Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim, also similar to differences between Shabbat and Chol. B'Shabbat hayani k'tzar b'yachid, u'b'magal echad, u'b'kupa echad. U'b'chol b'shlosha, b'shalosh kupot, b'shalosh magalot. Here comes the public issue. So on a weekday, let's start with the weekday. You would use 3 people to cut the crop, 3 boxes, and 3 sickles. Okay, it's a bit of a weird order. In the first part, it actually has the sickles first, which makes sense because the boxes are what you put it into. Okay, and some people say it's against the Baitusim. They wanted to make it public. Some explain it's Berov Am Hadrat Melech. It's just better to do things more people. It's more public. It's nicer to, like a better Hidor mitzvah, as we say, better mitzvah. Some people say it was to speed up the process. Okay, they didn't have a lot of time. It all had to be done that night and then for the next morning. But on Shabbat, you would do 1 person, 1 sickle, and 1 box. Chachamim omrim, echad Shabbat, echad Chol, b'shlosha, b'shalosh kupot, b'shalosh magalot. He says there's no different Shabbat and Chol. Now, it's a bit of a different machloket. The first one was, he was just saying there's no point to have more than 5. In the second machloket, the Chachamim are saying there's no problem with being Mechalel Shabbat in this way. Once you're allowed to be Mechalel Shabbat, you're allowed to be Mechalel Shabbat. I was thinking how relevant this was in my house for sure, with people going in and out of the army, sometimes on Shabbat. Okay, this happened this Shabbat, needing to be Mechalel Shabbat on Shabbat. Once something's permitted, it's permitted, right? So you're allowed to do it. Again, there's always questions. How do you do it? In what way? Can you do it? So these are questions that come up, and that's exactly the machloket here. Can you do it in the regular way, or do you do it differently because you should be, have less people mechalel Shabbat, have less, right? Okay. So now the Gemara starts off with the first machloket. Bishlama Rabbanan, we understand the rabbi's position. Kasavre isaron muvchar mishalosh seimate v'losh na b'chol losh na b'Shabbat. The rabbis obviously think you can get to a very fine, beautiful flour with, right? Maybe even fine isn't the right word because it's not the finest. It's grainy, granule. It's more granules without the powder in it. Okay, you don't want the powder, but you sift it a lot of times until you take the best of the best, and you have this very beautiful consistency. So 3 se'in is plenty to get 1/10 out of it. You can definitely get a good sifting done. Ella, there's a nice thing in the Koren, and actually, if you went to the Mincha workshop, you would have seen this, where there's a nice footnote where they basically discuss the different parts of the grain and what they're trying to do here. Just going to read a little bit, but there's the endosperm, the germ, and the bran. These are all parts of the grain, and you basically want to get the part of the endosperm that's the best, right? You want to root out the germ, root out the bran, and even within the endosperm, get to the best, right? They say through the sifting process, the bran is separated from the flour, which it itself is separated into different grades, and the highest grade is the high quality flour, which contains large particles of the endosperm. Next is the regular flour, which is the finer particles of that, and finally there's the inferior, which is the coarse flour, which has a lot of the germ mixed in. That's a little bit of education about that. Okay, but that's a very small, there's a lot more there. But, okay, so now they say, so it doesn't matter, Chol or Shabbat. Ela Rabbi Yishmael Mai Kasavar. What does he hold? Because, like I said before, if you have to be Mechalel Shabbat, you're Mechalel Shabbat. If you need the best, you need the best. So if he holds, the best Yissaron is only going to come from 5, afilu b'Shabbat nami, you should be allowed to do it even on Shabbat. And if it comes from 3, and that's enough, then afilu b'chol nami, then even on Chol you should use 3. So what exactly does he hold? Amarava kasavar Rabbi Yishmael Yissaron muvchar belo tircha ate mechamesh. Without much effort, you can get it from 5. In other words, because what happens when you sift it, you're gonna, if you take more, you can get to the best is the first ones that come, that you're gonna get eventually. You're gonna get the finest. You won't have to sift it as many times because you'll already have the right amount before you sift it too many times. If you start with 5. If you start with 3, you're going to have to sift it more times. So, b'tircha ate meshalosh. With more sifting, you can get from 3. So, what's the theory here? B'chol maitina mechamesh. That's shvicha milta. So, get it from 5 because then you're going to get really the best. Because if you take the biggest quantity, you will get the highest level right from there. But b'Shabbat mutav, we have other issues going on. Mutav sheyarbeh b'melacha achat b'har kada, which is the sifting. Va'al yarbeh b'melachot harbeh. If we say get 5, you're going to have people do all the parts of the process from reaping, the harvesting, cutting them, to the winnowing, the threshing, the winnowing, all that. You're going to have to do all those melachot, more of them, because you're going to have to take 5. Better to take 3. Less malacha of all the different melachot, there's only one malacha you're going to do more of. So it's an interesting theory here, right? Take one malacha, do it many times more, but at least you won't do multiple malachot more times. Okay, that's the theory. Amar Rabba, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, Amru Davar Echad. Now they're going to say this opinion of Rabbi Yishmael that we see here, that better to do less, right? Better to minimize on Shabbat. So it's the same as what Rabbi Yishmael ben Nosha, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says in a different place. Titania. Arba'asar shachal yom b'Shabbat, mafshit et Pesach ad chazeh. So when the 14th of Nisan, okay, we're getting up on Pesach. By the way, it reminds me, if you heard of Torah on Shabbat, So it was all about Menachot and the time of Yechezkel, and it had a bunch of things that we've learned, like this Parchatat. What was Yechezkel do? Why is he bringing that on Pesach, and what Parchatat did they time? So all sorts of things there that don't seem to match up with things of the Torah. And one of them I was noticing was Ephah for the Menachot. They use an Ephah. Now we don't use an Ephah. We use, depending on what it is, right? We use an Isaron or Shnei Esronim. There were different numbers of how many Esronim you use for the different Menachot for the Menachat Nesachim, but none of, right? And the Hin, we use a Revi'it Ayin, a Chatzi Ayin, a Shlishit Ayin, but not a whole Hin. So it's interesting. It raised a lot of questions about what's going on in that chapter in Yechezkel, and the descriptions don't match. Anyway, things I was much more minded to than I normally am because we're learning Menachot. So let's finish up. So Arba'ah Sar Shachal Liyot Shabbat. So if that's the day you're supposed to do the Korban Pesach, but remember you don't eat it till nighttime. But you have to take out the imurim, the parts you're going to burn on the altar, on your dalit. So if it's on Shabbat, what do? Mafshita tepesach ad hachazeh. You don't flay the animal completely, which you normally do. You just do it up to the chest so you can take out the innards and then leave it. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael ben Nosha Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Chachamim omrim ad sheyafshida kulo. You actually remove the entire thing, even though it's Shabbat. So here you see the same machloket. Do you do on Shabbat like you do on Chol, or do you do it, you minimize the malacha you're going to do? So Milo Amar Rabbi Yishmael ben Nosha Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Hatam kol echad efshar lo tachina. Right? We don't make you work harder if it's Shabbat. Better to do less. Hachanami, right? And you can manage with the little that you do, right? Less malacha, you can manage by taking out the imurim, which is what you need. And at night, you'll finish the process when it's not Shabbat anymore. As hachanami, same thing here. Kevanta efshar lo tarchina. The Gemara says not necessarily mimai, and with this we'll finish. Dilma al kano kam Rabbi Yishmael hacha ela deleka bizayon kodashim. Maybe Rabbi Yishmael said it here we minimize because there's no bizayon of the kodshim, but there you're going to leave an animal half flayed. It's like disgraceful to kodshim. So hatam diikak bizayon kodshim ema lecha kerabanan svirle. Maybe Rabbi Yishmael would hold by Rabbanan there and not by Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka when it comes to disgracing kodshim. Whereas here that's not the issue. So maybe he would say, look, it's fine to do the 3, and better to do less. Okay. So with that we finish. So we summarize the first part. We'll just summarize the end part. We have these 2 machlokot, both relating to issues of can you be mechalel Shabbat? Do you do it the same way on Chol as you do it on Shabbat? But they were a little bit different because, right, one in the end you're going to end up with the same product, and the other we're going to basically do things differently on Shabbat because we want to minimize, right? And the rabbis say this really, in both cases, the rabbis see no reason to distinguish, but for different reasons. There they say you could get to the same, right? 3 is sufficient. There's no reason to ever do 5. And in the second case, they just think that it should be done the way it should be done, and it doesn't matter if it's Shabbat or not Shabbat. Okay. Anyway, that raises interesting issues about, again, when Chilul Shabbat is permitted and how you're supposed to relate to it. Okay, with that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a good week, maybe a quiet week, and Shin Shema B'Sarot Tova.